Welcome. Thank you for joining us just a few days before Christmas for this special presentation with Professor Jim Wilson. We'll start in a moment or two. I see we've got quite a lot of interest. We had, I think, about 100 people signed up for the webinar, so quite a few people still making their way into the webinar itself. Whilst we're waiting, for those of you who don't know, my name's Neil McClements. I'm the Chief Executive of Haemochromatosis UK, and I'm very pleased to welcome Jim Wilson, Professor of Human Genetics at the University of Edinburgh, to today's webinar. Jim and his team have been working over recent years to better understand the genetic makeup of island communities across Scotland and to provide actionable insights that improve public health. Earlier this year, Haemochromatosis UK funded additional research designed to identify people at risk of haemochromatosis and to build an atlas of GH prevalence across the UK. Jim will be discussing his team's work shortly, followed by a Q&A. So for anybody who's joined us on the webinar and has a question, please hold on to those questions or pop them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. If you're not familiar with Zoom, it's a little box just at the bottom of your screen on whichever type of device you're using. If you put your question in there, we will make a point of coming round to those questions at the end of the presentation. Just to confirm, for those of you who are not already aware, this recording is in progress now. We're recording this webinar in order to share it with Haemochromatosis UK members over the coming days. And so without further ado, let me hand over to Professor Jim Wilson. Welcome, Jim.
Thanks very much, Neil, and thanks to everyone for attending today. Yeah, I'll just try to share my screen, see if we can get that to work well. So I have to choose PowerPoint, share. See if we can get it to go onto slideshow. So Neil, can you confirm for me that you're seeing the full screen?
Yep, everything's great there. Yeah, thanks, Jim.
Okay, great. So I'll just go ahead then. I'm very happy to be here today and to explain a little bit about our work and the work that we want to do. And I've entitled the talk, "The Landscape of Haemochromatosis Causing Genetic Variation Across Britain and Ireland." So here's a quick outline of what the talk's going to include. So I'm going to describe haemochromatosis. I probably don't need to go into much detail for this audience, but just to bring everyone up to the same level of understanding. I'm going to talk a little bit about screening, because I actually believe screening's a very important tool that isn't being used, and some work that's been done on how that might be very cost effective. I'm then going to go on to our study, which, as I said, is of the landscape of genetic risk. So I'm going to highlight the three sort of prongs of our plan. One, looking at genetic risk. Two, looking at the disease prevalence, the prevalence of the diagnosis itself, rather than the risk. And three, looking at return of results to volunteers in Viking genes, specifically looking at people who have a high risk of haemochromatosis. I'm then going to tell you a little bit about some genetic screening programs that exist in the UK that not everybody is probably aware of, and I hope convince you that there's actually a gap in the UK's genomic medicine strategy as it stands today, and something that hopefully we can all work together to fix and fill this gap. Apologies, I've got a tiny bit of a cough, but hopefully it won't affect us too badly. So, haemochromatosis, I'm a geneticist. I'm becoming a clinical geneticist, and so I work on genetic diseases, and haemochromatosis is actually the most common genetic disease. And as you'll all know, it causes the body to load excess iron. And this eventually becomes toxic to many different organs across the body, but particularly, obviously, the liver, but also the joints, and indeed the brain. Women are mostly protected through their monthly cycle and concomitant loss of iron before the menopause. So this disease affects men earlier in their lives, but then it also affects women afterwards, and they begin to catch up with the rates. And it's been studied for years, and actually some people have called it the Celtic curse on account of it appearing to be more common in the sort of formerly Celtic-speaking regions, namely Ireland and Scotland. So this is actually a very serious disease. There was a large study by Lucas et al. Earlier this year using the 500,000 person UK Biobank database, and they looked at people with hemochromatosis, but they looked forward in time up, so they followed them up longitudinally up to the age of 80 years old. And what this did was reveal very, very strong risks. So I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but you see halfway down the list of outcomes here is liver cancer. And you can see this sort of wine-colored dot away out here. This indicates that people with hemochromatosis have an 8-fold risk of liver cancer compared to people in here who do not have the hemochromatosis genetic variants. You see here near the top, there's a 6-fold increase in risk of fibrosis or cirrhosis, also very serious liver diseases. And indeed, there's a sort of 3-fold risk in the second row here of any liver disease at all. There's a 2-fold risk of osteoarthritis, almost 2-fold risk of having a hip or a knee replacement, and many, many other heightened risks. Down here, second from the bottom, there's a sort of 1.5 to 1.7-fold risk of any brain outcome. So this is across many different organ systems, and they're not just, a 2% or a 4% increase in risk. This is 8-fold, 6-fold, 3-fold, really significant differences to your risk profile. And these risks increase with age. So here we have 4 graphs, and if we concentrate on the top left here, the one where I've written increase with age across it, you can see along the horizontal axis is the age of the individuals in the study, going from 40 up to 80 as they get older, and up the side is the percentage of people who have liver disease. And you can see 2 different curves, a sort of pinky one for people who have the famous C282Y homozygous genetic risk variant for hemochromatosis, and the blue one for people who have none of the hemochromatosis risk variants. And you can see from age 50, it begins separating out, eventually to a huge difference by the age of 80 in the risk of liver disease. You see a very similar pattern on the top right for joint replacement. And later in life, you start to see a separation between this 282Y homozygotes and everyone else for brain outcomes and even for mortality itself. So this disease kills people earlier than people who do not have it. Now, I said this is a genetic disease. We understand where this disease comes from. Couldn't we just screen everyone for it? And so some people have done some health economics to try to assess whether this would be cost effective. Clearly, it would have a cost, screening hundreds of thousands or indeed millions of people. But this review, also from this year, looking at 39 studies across multiple different health systems in the USA, in the UK, Canada, Australia, Germany, the Netherlands, across all these places, it concluded that screening would be cost effective. And this didn't even take into account the saved costs of treating liver cancer, cirrhosis and arthritis, nor yet the substantial gains to be had from the blood donations that arise from the treatment of hemochromatosis. In the author's own words, they had 3 key points for decision makers. And 1, screening of blood donors for hereditary hemochromatosis can decrease third-party payer healthcare costs in the long term. 2, population screening programs for HH are cost-effective compared with no screening. And 3, pharmacoeconomic studies for screening and treatment of patients should be performed in more countries. So I think that's very clear. But if we are to do screening, it's very unlikely we're going to be able to screen all of the 70 million or however many people live in the UK on day one. We're going to have to start somewhere. So we believe hemochromatosis is more common in people of Irish or Scottish ancestry. And clearly, I think it's obvious to anyone, the higher the frequency, the more cost-effective the screening will be. For a given number of people that you've screened, or a fixed cost, you're going to find more individuals who are at risk of the disease. You're going to get more bang for your buck, as the parlance goes. So we wondered, well, Scotland's quite a big place, Ireland's quite a big place. Can we be more specific? Does it vary within these countries? And that's what our grant from Haemochromatosis UK, the Furneaux Award, that's what we are setting out to do. That's what I mean by the landscape. I mean, how is this risk distributed across the land, distributed across geography? So we want to make a map of the UK and Ireland, showing where the risk of hemochromatosis is most common in different regions. And this map here is not about hemochromatosis. This map is a map I drew years ago, looking at the frequency of red hair variants, because they also vary in a somewhat similar way across Britain and Ireland. And so I'll be looking to build a map a little bit like this, perhaps a touch more detailed, as we've been able to update our methods of doing things. And I hope that this will be extremely useful for future planning of screening. We're not going to recruit any new people to look at this. We're using data from very large studies that are available at the University of Edinburgh, such as my own Viking Genes study, the UK Biobank that we've mentioned, Generation Scotland, as well as a number of studies from the Republic of Ireland, from the Royal College of Surgeons there in Dublin, so that we get the full picture across these islands. And it's important to note that these people were not recruited for a study of hemochromatosis. They are volunteers for studies generally of health. So we will have an unbiased sample. But before we start, it's useful to go over what is known. The best summary I could find reviewing the literature was from Heath et al. In 2016. And I say best, it's a bit variable. Some places, clearly here you can see 12,000 people in Wales. I'd call that a good sample. 184 people in Scotland isn't really good enough, but it is what we have. And you can see I've ordered the top populations here in a simple table by the frequency of the major allele causing hemochromatosis. And you can see that it is true. The genetic risk is clearly highest in Ireland and in Scotland. But if you look at where is England in the picture, halfway down the table, way down here, actually nearest to the Netherlands, the English risk is considerably lower. But there's little finer grained detail. Orkney actually is here. And you can see it's not a big sample, but it's almost the same as the Czech Republic in Central Europe. So there's a suggestion that there might be considerable variation when you look, within England, within Ireland, within Scotland in particular. And that's what we really wanted to find out. These people drew a map, but it's not the most useful map. I don't think it just confirms that it's higher in the British Isles and Ireland, which anecdotally we knew already. We want to do better than this and hopefully provide more useful insights. So we're going to be using data from over 500,000 volunteers. So we've got very large numbers in each place so that we can discount the effects of chance and hopefully the effects of bias and confounding. And we're planning to look at 29 regions that you can see here. I think 8 of them are in Scotland. We've got 8 also in England, plus 4 metropolitan areas, 2 areas in Wales, and we've been able to split Ireland up into 5 sort of areas. So this is going to be considerably more zoomed in detail than has been the case hitherto. So that's the genetic risk map. The second arm of the project is to look at disease prevalence. And we're really delighted with this new tool that has been made available from NHS England. Unfortunately, not available for Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. It's called DigiTrials, and it's a service, as the name suggests, for people who want to run a clinical trial. But the really, really cool thing is that it allows you to access summary data for all 63 million people who are registered with a GP in NHS England. And you can split this down by age, by sex, by ethnicity, and by area. And you can do that by splitting it up in to the 42 regions here. They call them integrated care boards, or you can add them together into larger regions of England, as you can see coloured in on the map here. And indeed, you can look by trust. So there are 134 NHS trusts in England, and we're going to be able to tell you the prevalence of haemochromatosis diagnosis across all of these trusts. So we'll be able to draw a broad scale map, but we'll also be able to home in on any hotspots or apparent hotspots and really learn a lot from that. And I'm really excited actually about this, because what I want to look at is the comparison between the genetic risk that we're getting from our cohort studies and the prevalence of diagnosed people that we're going to get from DigiTrials, and then subtract the one from the other and see where there has been underdiagnosis of this disease, because we believe it is probably widely underdiagnosed. And given that the vast majority of the risk comes from the genetic variants, we're going to be able to show quite accurately where in England this disease is being underdiagnosed. So I think that's another side to it that I hadn't fully realised until we started getting in among the data. We'll also provide the first true rate of the first estimate England-wide of how many are diagnosed, and we'll be able to see what variation there is across England from north to south, east to west. And as I've just gotten ahead of myself with excitement, we'll be able to compare to the genetic map and see if they look the same or are they completely and utterly different. But they ought not to be if diagnosis is occurring at the same rates across the country. Yes, or under diagnosis. So moving on to the third part of our little grant. This relates to the Viking genes studies. These are the studies I've been running for 20 years in the islands of Scotland. They're genetic and health studies, and we're very happy to have recruited 10,000 Scottish Islanders, or the children of Scottish Islanders, focusing first on Orkney, an archipelago immediately off the north of Scotland, where I come from. And highlighted here with yellow points. And then secondly on Shetland, where my dad comes from, further out into the ocean and highlighted with orange points. But we then moved on in more recent times, just before COVID hit us, to recruit Hebrideans, highlighted here with blue points in the Western Isles of Scotland. But of course, also these people have diasporas, particularly in mainland Scotland, in the cities of Scotland, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Aberdeen, Inverness, but also in rural places. And indeed, we've uncovered a diaspora across England and even have recruits from Canada and New Zealand and other parts of the world. So, of course, the genetics of the islands are important for their diasporas as well, because you bring your DNA with you. We recruited adult volunteers with at least 2 Islander grandparents. And we found out a lot in the years since we set this up. We've shown that the gene pools are really quite distinct. And that's partly because of a Norse component. Many of these islands were colonies of the Scandinavian Vikings over 1,000 years ago, and we still see an element of that shining through. But what I think's more important is that they've simply been genetically isolated for centuries and really have had very few immigrants. And this has allowed the gene pool to sort of evolve in isolation in its own direction. And what's happened is that a very large number of what we call founder variants, so these are variants that are otherwise very rare, but have risen to a higher frequency in these islands. And some of them are very important. We found one island in Scotland where 1 in 20 people carries a BRCA1 variant that causes breast and ovarian cancer. The normal rates are something more like 1 in 300. So it's become really incredibly common. And we found many such variants like this. And what we've been doing, we're only the second cohort in the UK to do this, is returning these results to individuals. So unlike in UK Biobank, unlike in Generation Scotland, unlike in ALSPAC and all these famous studies, if someone in my study has a BRCA1 or a BRCA2 variant or a hemochromatosis variant, we send them a letter to make them aware of that. And we have evidence that we have been saving lives in this way. So the kind of letters we send are all related to what we call actionable findings. So these are harmful gene changes or variants which are linked to serious diseases, but which can be prevented or improved by NHS treatment. We don't look at the things that we can do nothing about. So in each case, early knowledge of risk could enhance how well the preventative measure or the cure works. These are the things, these are the bits of your genome that it's beneficial to know about. And we follow an 81 gene list that has been drawn up by the American College of Medical Genetics. And it includes a variety of diseases: hereditary breast cancer, as I've alluded to with the BRCA genes, familial high cholesterol, which if untreated causes heart attacks. There are fatal heart arrhythmias that are genetic, which if untreated can lead to cardiac arrest and death. There are cardiomyopathy, so this is a long word, but it's basically a disease of the heart muscle, which can, if left untreated, lead to heart failure. And finally, a group of metabolic diseases, of which hemochromatosis is one. So we have completed the return of the results for our first two cohorts. We ran this as an opt-in procedure. You didn't have to receive your results. You could exercise your right not to know. And so for those who consented and had a variant, we've sent 64 return of results letters. And this included, I think it was 10 hemochromatosis letters. And then in our online cohort, our more recent cohorts called Viking 2 and 3, for hemochromatosis, I think I have 40 or 41 letters to send. And we're literally working on that this week. And I hope to get the letters printed out so that we can send them first week back, really, first week of January. It's quite a lot of work doing the checking and making sure it's right. And in all cases, we have an agreement with NHS Grampian Clinical Genetics, who look after the islands, and they will validate these results. And it basically empowers the volunteers to take action and has a direct impact on their health because they can follow a different pathway of care via the NHS. And of course, the cascade testing, the testing that happens to the siblings, maybe the parents or the children of a carrier, expands our impact in the real world beyond the people who volunteered for our studies. So I hope this can also, as well as being impactful for the islanders of Scotland, it can act as an exemplar for broader scale screening in the wider population. And this is not a fantasy. Because in fact, this kind of broad scale screening already happens in the UK, specifically for the Jewish community in England. There's a program, launched last year, and it's called J-BRCA, for Jewish BRCA, named after these BRCA genes that cause breast, ovarian cancers. And BRCA2 can cause prostate cancer in men, as well as male breast cancer. And the key thing about J-BRCA is that you do not need a family history of cancer. You just need to have one or more Jewish grandparents. And what happens is they test 3 BRCA variants, which, just like in Orkney or in Shetland, in the Jewish population that has had very little immigration and is almost like a genetic island, even though they're not living on an island, they've become much more common there. They're founder variants. And this is done postally using saliva kits and with online counselling. I think this is a great program and another exemplar of how things ought to be. But there's a small problem. It's only available to people who are cared for by NHS England. It's not available in Scotland, Wales, or Northern Ireland, probably due to things to do with funding that are, above my pay grade. and I don't work for the NHS, but I just wanted to highlight that this is going on in the UK, and this is the kind of thing that I think we need in various places. And it's not just about breast cancer. There is another independent program called Genetics, probably meaning Jewish genetics, and they test for 47 different diseases that have become more common in Jewish communities. They do this testing in clinic, they do this testing in campus, and they do this testing in sixth form students and others above the age of 16 in schools. So it's a very broad program, and this kind of thing is also going to be needed in some of the Scottish island groups, in my opinion. So I had a look what is actually going on. And so there's a genomic medicine strategy in Scotland. There's also one in England. My slide has the Scottish one because I'm more focused on Scotland. And this is a 5-year strategy signed off in April 2024 by the Scottish Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care, Neil Gray. And I mean, I just want to draw your attention to one point in the executive summary. Our vision is to establish an equitable genomic medicine service. That's a laudable vision, and I wholeheartedly agree with it, except the delivery of genomic medicine in Britain is not equitable, not at all. There's no mention anywhere in the document of haemochromatosis, which, as you will remember, is the most common genetic disease. There's no mention anywhere in the document of distinct gene pools, which I have shown is true of the Western Isles, of Orkney, of Shetland, and of their diaspora. You know, this number's 100,000 people altogether, at least. And there's no mention of genetic screening in the absence of a family history. So I don't think it's equitable. And the Jewish population in Glasgow cannot access JBRCA. So we need similar programs to JBRCA and genetics, obviously tailored to the populations that we'll be working with for the Northern Isles and the Western Isles, and quite possibly for Northern Ireland, depending on the outcome of this project with regard to haemochromatosis. We know from my studies and other studies in the Jewish populations that using the NHS method, that is cascading out from known carriers to their siblings, to their parents, to their children, perhaps their aunts and uncles, it misses half of the carriers. When you take an unbiased, population-based approach, you find twice as many people as you find with Cascade. That's a powerful statistic. And so I hope our map will highlight the areas of the greatest need for haemochromatosis and where perhaps screening ought to begin. And Viking Genes, at the same time as building the evidence base for Shetland, Orkney, and the Western Isles. I think there's a need, but also an opportunity here for a change in how medicine is done, a change to a preventative approach, not treating people when they're already ill and broken, but to treating them and preventing them, either catching them early or before they even have disease. And the tool to do this is genetic screening of people who don't have a family history. I mean, obviously, we want to screen those with a family history as well, but I mean population-based screening. So in summary, we're going to map out the landscape of genetic risk of haemochromatosis across Britain and Ireland, and including the islands, and not just in the big cities, the whole country, both these countries, so that we're better able to target future genetic screening programs. And I think there's a considerable and important and awful, actually, gap in the genomic medicine strategies for Scotland and England. It's not presently equitable. So very many people over many years have been part of these studies, and there are too many to thank here, but I'd just like to highlight Ed Gilbert at RCSI in Ireland, who is working hard, probably right now. I've been getting many emails from him today and yesterday on producing the genetic map, the landscape, and also Shona Kerr, who's standing next to me in the photo with Edinburgh skyline in the background, who is busy working on this project as well. If you're interested in Viking Genes, you can follow us on various social media there, or look at our website, viking.ed.ac.uk, to keep up with what we're doing. There's also many funding bodies to thank, but the people I'm most indebted to are all of Viking Genes, volunteers without whom we could never do any of this work. And these thanks extend to volunteers for all the other studies that we're going to be using in this work. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to stop my screen sharing now in a second, and I'll be very happy to take any questions. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jim. Actually, a nice kind of round trip around the work that you're doing. A huge amount of work that's been done over the last 20 years. And we're kind of at the tail end of all of that, I suppose, in terms of being able to generate actionable insights from that data set. As we said earlier, we welcome people's questions. If you've joined the webinar in the last few minutes and you have a question, if you want to pop it into the Q&A box at the bottom, we'll work our way through those. We'll see how many of those we can get done. We're going to try and answer as many questions as we possibly can today. So if you do have a question, pop it into the Q&A box and we'll come around to you in turn. Okay, so we've had some questions submitted prior to today's session. I'm going to hold on to those for the moment, but maybe we could start first of all with a question which is from Seamus Breslin, a friend of ours from the Creggan in Derry in Northern Ireland. And he just says, aren't the stats for GH prevalence in Northern Ireland shocking?
Well, yes. I'm not going to be drawn on our map till we've really got it properly put together. But yes, we see certain areas that are a lot higher. We're still working on it. We want to be able to. We think we have the capability to. So when we do our analysis of our population, we see two different populations in Northern Ireland, and these are quite likely to be the Catholics and the Protestants. The one population is found in Northern Ireland and in Lowland Scotland. The other population is only found in Northern Ireland, and the first population's nearest relatives are in Scotland. The second population's nearest relatives are in Ireland. So these are probably these two communities. So we're going to be the first people, I think, to be able to separate out whether there's a difference in risk between the two communities in Northern Ireland, which I think will be something new and something quite interesting. But I can agree with you. It's very high there. I will say, by way of maybe a bit of a tease, we have discovered somewhere else that is very high as well. But you'll have to wait till January, just till we need to do everything twice and double check, and Ed does it and then I do it. And just because we're going to be making these claims, we want to be absolutely 100% sure. But I agree with you. It's shocking. There's a many-fold difference between the highest part of the country and the lowest part. I mean, we knew that, but we are picking up these differences in our data set. So it's all making sense so far.
Right. Thanks, Jim. So Lisa's got a question relating actually more to sort of northeastern England. She's saying that a lot of Vikings and Celts came down the east coast, particularly places like East Yorkshire, Whitby and so on. And she knows a lot of farmers in the area who have got relatives or ancestry going back to Norway and Scandinavia. There's a lot of Irish in and around Leeds and West Yorkshire. Lisa asks, what is this project going to do in terms of these particular areas in the northeast of England?
Yep, so we have over 25,000 people from Cumbria and Northumbria. I forget the figures, over 30,000 people from Yorkshire. And, really decent figures for all of these areas. So they'll all be part of the map. I don't actually believe that hemochromatosis is very much to do with the Vikings at all. I really think it's a Celtic disease. The red-haired map I showed you, if I could summarize it, there was a high frequency of red hair in central Scotland, Ireland, and a little bit in the north of England, and it had been diluted in the south of England, probably by Anglo-Saxons, and it had been diluted in Orkney and Shetland, probably by Scandinavian Vikings. And I would not be surprised if we saw a similar pattern with hemochromatosis. But we are looking in all the ridings of Yorkshire We're looking also taking account of the Irish who have moved to England. So in Digi trials, it's brilliant because they have one of the ethnicities is white Irish and another one is white British. So we're able to look at the Irish who are living in England separately from the white British declared who are living there as well. We also have over 10,000 Irish who are in UK Biobank. So they were recruited in the UK, but they declare a place of birth either in Northern Ireland or in the Republic of Ireland. So that's a significant resource for the genetic aspect of it. So I hope we have all these different elements covered. And if we were to see a prominent peak in Leeds or anywhere else, I'm not going with preconceived. I'm not just looking at Belfast. I'm not just looking at, we're looking everywhere with good, big sample sizes in all these places so that we'll have a proper, robust map.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks for the question, Lisa, as well. Marianne's got a question which I think is related to the study that you cited, the Lucas study, the biobank study from 2024. Marianne wonders, are the risks still relevant to those who've been treated by vivisection, or are they in safer territory?
I don't know. I didn't carry out the study. What I think was done was that everyone was lumped together, irrespective of whether they were being treated or not. So if that is the case, I would expect the risks for the untreated to be even higher, because in the graphs I showed you, I would predict they have been diluted out by the lower risks of those who are being treated. I'm not a doctor of medicine, but it's very clear that people who are being treated and their iron levels are being controlled do not have the same risk of these negative outcomes as the untreated people. The other thing that was interesting about the graphs is it included C282Y homozygotes who had not got a diagnosis of hereditary hemochromatosis, because they were showing all these nasty outcomes. They just hadn't been diagnosed. So they lumped them together. So I think it was just everyone, but of course, the people who are being treated ought not to show this risk profile.
And I think one of the other things which has been noted about the UK Biobank data set generally is that it manifests a healthy volunteer bias for many conditions, and quite probably also for hemochromatosis. So perhaps the situation is actually not as rosy as it might look from that biobank study, simply because there's a volunteer bias. So people who were recruited to that study had a slightly more attention to their health, or perhaps were a little bit more focused on looking after themselves, and as a result, their outcomes tended to be better. So that may also be another factor.
That's true, and that's a concern for all of these studies. That's difficult to get around. But the one thing we can do in our study to counteract that is in Digi trials, which has everyone in England, we can look by deprivation decile, so split people into 10 groups of deprivation and check out how hemochromatosis specifically varies across from the rich to the poor. And I mean, we have good data to explore that and look to see if it's a vast difference or a small difference, and which direction it is. So I hadn't thought we'll do that.
Okay, so we're refining the project as we go. So that's the great benefit of actually having the GH community on this call. That's great. Thank you very much. The next question comes from someone who's anonymous, and I think it actually relates again a question to that Lucas 2024 biobank study. And the question is, in that study, was Lucas's data focused only on males who were untreated, or was it related to people who were in maintenance?
Yep, so it's essentially the same question. Again, I didn't carry out the study. I'm just showing their data. I assume it's everyone lumped together, both those who are treated and those who are untreated, and it definitely also includes people with no diagnosis, but they are 2A2Y homozygotes. The study was also done on females. Just to save the number of graphs I showed you the male graphs. The female graphs look similar, but there's a delay, and then things start going poorly. It would be interesting for Lucas or anyone else with the skills and the time and the access to the data to repeat these analyses, splitting the people according to treatment or no treatment. And there's no other way except that those risks must be worse than what I presented. We don't have the precise skill set to do that right at this minute, but someone should do that. Yeah.
And I think, like with all of these things, the analysis has to be based on the data, and if the data is not coded correctly, or you can't get the diagnosis codes, then you're kind of stuck, right? Which I think is probably the situation that team found themselves in, because coding for hemochromatosis is notoriously poor across the NHS, and so it's really difficult to kind of do analysis based on data which you fundamentally don't have.
Yeah, data that exactly. It's messy and mucky and hard, and yeah, that's what most work is wrangling data. The statistics bit takes an hour and 4 weeks of trying to get the data clean.
Great. We have a question from Karen. Karen asks, how do we combat the pharmaceutical industry's resistance to screening? I have an answer for this actually, but I'll see what Jim. Do you want to have a go at this first?
Yeah, I mean, I have moved from population genetics and complex trait genetics into this clinical area in the last few years, and I'm a bit dumbfounded still where all this resistance is coming from. Also, not just from the pharmaceutical industry, but from medicine, from the old guard of medics, because I think it's just completely wrong-headed. And so I'm still getting my head round it. I am working in various ways. One, to provide an evidence base that you need. You can't do anything without having a good evidence base. So we're all working on that. Two, to actually try to get some screening going, particularly in Shetland, to show people that it can be done. It's welcomed. It saves lives, which is another form of evidence base. But really showing by doing. And three, by going to Parliament, the Scottish one and the Westminster one, to try to effect change. That's what I'm doing. But and I think Neil works hard on this as well. And I know we will win. I know in the future, in 50 years' time, everyone will be screened for everything. At least in well-off countries, if we're still a well-off country by then. But why wait for 50 years? That's the fight we have.
Yeah, I would just echo that, actually. And I think in the charities experience, actually, there is zero resistance from the pharmaceutical industry. The pharmaceutical industry are very comfortable and very accustomed to supporting and facilitating these types of things. Actually, where the problem is as Jim's described, in the old guard in the clinical community. And we've had some very lively discussions with some of those people who are just fundamentally philosophically opposed to preventative healthcare. I'm afraid that's the bottom line. They don't want more customers. They don't want more people to be diagnosed. Everything's very convenient for them at the moment. And as a consequence, things like screening make people of that ilk quite nervous, because if you screen communities, you will inevitably find people at risk. And some of those people are at risk, you will find actually they need treatment. And so you end up finding more customers, which, as from the charity's perspective, that's actually one of the key things that we were set up to do back in 1990 by Janet Furnau, who we've named this award after. So, so it's not the pharmaceutical industry in our experience, Karen, that's the problem. The problem is with a very, very small number of clinicians, mostly in the gastro and hepatology communities. Geneticists totally get this. The nursing community totally get it. The rheumatology community totally get it. But there is still this resistance from what Jim has described as the old guard. We'll move on to another question, more specific question, actually. So I've got a question, and then I'm going to table one of the ones that has popped up in the Q&A. So Jim, with respect to your specific data set, your Viking 1, Viking 2, Viking 3 data set, am I correct in assuming that you said you'd found, was it 51 people who had hemochromatosis within that data set that did not previously know that they had it?
It's 41. I don't actually know whether they previously knew or not. I just see what I see. From previous work, I think the vast majority do not know. We haven't set it up we didn't think at the beginning to try. We'll have to get an ethical amendment and go back and ask people if they already knew, because that's not in our protocol at the minute. I just thought I was doing a good thing to tell them. I didn't realize that you need to collect statistics on every little thing. But so we'll, once it's done and dusted, I would like to go back and get the precise answer to your question about how many new ones we're finding. As I said, generally, half the people that we find know nothing about it, and the NHS don't even know about it. So.
And I suppose the follow-up question then is, so you're writing to these individuals, and the question that's come up in the Q&A is what counselling provision is there for those people who receive those letters telling them that they've got this pathogenic mutation or that they're at risk of iron overload?
Yep. So in the first two studies that we did, the counselling was provided directly by NHS Grampian, who provide the clinical genetics service to the whole of the north of Scotland, above a certain line on a map. When another place takes it over, we've changed things slightly now so as to not overwhelm them, such that I think they were going to be doing the counselling remote, by Zoom, which is a big change for that. It's one that we all know needs to happen, because counselling is one of the bottlenecks in this whole procedure. And a lot of the care is going to be taken on by the GPs. There apparently already exists a pathway for this in the Western Isles of Scotland, which must have arisen because of there being a bit more of it there than is in Orkney or in Shetland. And so we altered our protocol to guide the people into that pathway of care, and so their GP will take the lead on it. I don't think GPs will have a genetic counselling service, but that is going to be provided remotely. So everyone will be cared for, but they're not getting counselling in advance. So only the people who are the carriers will then go ahead to find this out. We've also included the booklets that Haemochromatosis UK have put together that are very nice and have kindly given to us in the envelope packages that I'll be making up first week back in January, which have a lot of information and guidance to places where further information can be sought, including from Haemochromatosis UK's own helplines. So I think they'll be well looked after, and we received ethical permission to do this literally last week, which is why we're now preparing the letter. So it's been through independent scrutiny as to, that we're not harming anybody. But it's a bit different from what it's been. But we keep having to push these boundaries, because we're going to have to break down various of these old ways of doing things. If there's any hope of expanding things out to hundreds of thousands or indeed millions, you need scalable approaches to all the different levels, and they're not very scalable at the minute.
Oh, indeed. Another question from an anonymous attendee, a question about the Digi trials data set. Will you be looking at all genotypes, including compound hetero?
Yep, so we don't have genotypes from the Digi trials, people. That's just diagnoses. But from UK Biobank, of course, we do. Yes, we'll be making maps of 282Y homozygotes, maps of compound heterozygotes, and we're actually going to make a map where I combine the risk of both into I don't know what the word's going to be of it, but a combined risk, for lack of a better word, so that everyone can look at whichever map is their favorite map, but we will make all these maps. What I'll say is that the H63D allele, so the other variant, for those of you who know about it, does not vary in frequency very much across the British Isles. So adding it in the rough and ready work I've done really makes very little difference in terms of place 1 versus place 2, because the frequency of the compound heterozygotes is determined almost in the variation in the frequency of the compound heterozygotes between John O'Groats and Land's End is determined almost entirely by the variation in the frequency of the C282Y allele, which I've already mapped in the first map. So I'll I'm doing it all, but it doesn't change things very much or at all, really.
Okay, so good news for people who are compound hetero, and I guess that possibly the reason why that question was asked was actually we regularly have people contacting us. About 20% of the charity's membership are H63D homozygote or compound hetero, and they struggle tremendously to be taken seriously by the NHS. And in very regular cases, actually are denied treatment, even though they've very obviously got iron overload. So again, it's another way, I guess, of sort of challenging that old guard mentality where, you know, there are some people who've done studies on the UK Biobank who are absolutely convinced that really C282I homozygotes are the only people that we should be thinking about. But as our own membership demonstrates very clearly, we have, as I say, 1 in 5 of our community fall into some of these other groups where they're manifestly unwell. And in most cases, they're receiving some form of treatment for it. Which does tend to suggest that actually the analysis of the UK biobanks may be sort of looking at one particular thing, but not necessarily looking at everything as you might reasonably expect. We have a question here just relating to other forms of hemochromatosis. So type 2, type 3, type 4, which certainly type 4 follows a different kind of inheritance pattern. What's going on with those types, those non-HFE variants of hemochromatosis in this study?
So we haven't at present planned to particularly look at those, but we of course could. And as long as there's a defined genetic. So my understanding is that type 2 and type 3 are from variants in other genes. We have the data across the exomes, so that all the genes of these people. So we can look at that as well. I'm not sure if there's any prior evidence that varies in frequency. I mean, it's easy to look at. I need to take notes now on the things I have to do differently.
Not more work for you, Jim.
Yeah.
You and Jonah are going to be busy over Christmas.
We can look at that. I anticipate that they are very, very rare indeed, and thus may not, but they may vary. I don't know. If I knew the answer, I wouldn't have to do it, right? So we can have a look at that as well. It hadn't actually entered into the plan, so thank you for asking.
We've seen actually on our helpline, we've seen quite an interesting pattern emerging just over the last 6 or 9 months. And we're not quite sure why this is happening, but actually we're seeing quite a lot of people with Pakistani heritage who are coming forward having had a type 2 diagnosis, which, for those of you not familiar, is often thought of as a juvenile variant, although juvenile doesn't mean like small children. It tends to mean teenagers and young adults. And we're seeing a lot of people from that community coming forward with that specific variant for the first time. And again, this is this is another kind of thing that in some clinical circles, you'll see academic papers saying it's a white Northern European condition. But people from Pakistan or have Pakistani heritage aren't white Northern Europeans, and they're also receiving diagnoses of these less common non-HFE variants of the condition. So I think that the charity's view is to try and be sort of open-eyed and mindful of these things, and to see, to look at these things and explore them in order to try and understand a little bit more about them, because they're very much under-researched at the moment, aren't they, Jim?
Yep, so we're very much want to be inclusive, and we are not presenting it in the map, but there will be a table for ethnic minorities. So, for instance, British, Pakistani, British, Indian, British, Bangladeshi, Chinese, and so on, Ashkenazi Jews, and all this, most of whom have very, very low frequencies, very near to zero, but they're not all exactly zero, and there's some variation in there. I think I was looking at this yesterday, that the Pakistani community was notably higher than the Bangladeshi community, for instance. But don't quote, I've broken my own rule now of not saying anything. There was variability within that, and that might be valuable, because this is also based on thousands of samples. So it's robust to these kinds of small number chance effects. We'll definitely look at the other genes as well while we're at it. Now we've kind of got this set up to look at HFE. It's not actually that much work to just run it through for the other ones to see if we see anything notable there. We've also taken care to separate out Afro-Caribbeans from West Africans, who are quite distinct genetically, particularly in that the Afro-Caribbeans tend to have 20% European ancestry, which the West Africans do not have. And so that is going to impart, in my opinion, a risk of hemochromatosis. So I want to check whether that has come to be the case. So we're very much looking at all of the people who live in the UK. The UK Biobank has 500,000 people, so it actually has relatively big sample, even of like Germans, Italians, Polish, obviously, Lithuanian, I think. So both the ethnic minorities and the people from other countries who live in the UK, we have the data, so we're putting it all into a table in case it's useful for whichever future purpose.
Right, we have a question from Hull, who's based in Wales, and he wonders, do you think DigiTools will be expanded to include the other devolved countries in the UK soon? As the awareness of the condition in Wales is particularly poor, its inclusion would be welcome.
I would love for it to I mean, I can't believe this tool exists because and it's not being used because I love they reply to my emails within 10 seconds of me. So they obviously got funding from somewhere and nothing to do, right? And so we've turned up to do this and they're just delighted and they answer, and all the huge rigmarole of bureaucracy just almost melted away. We had to pay £2,500, but we were able to do that. And boom, it's absolutely amazing, world beating. And I absolutely hope so. I assume it's because of funding structures I don't know anything about. NHS Wales, NHS Scotland will have their own funding structures and they haven't paid into the correct bit or something for this to happen. But we ought to have a very small campaign to try and make that happen. I have no idea who to write to, but it's a wonderful tool. Our paper will be quite a nice exemplar of the use of DigiTools. It was set up for someone who wants to run a trial on, he needs to find, I've no idea, people with rheumatoid arthritis who are not on this drug or they are on that drug, and it'll tell you, there's 100 of them in Leeds. And so go to Leeds and do your trial. We're using it for a completely different purpose, but I think there will be many people studying many different diseases who would be interested in this huge data set to be able to see how many people have it, where they are, their ethnicities, their ages, etc., etc. It's a wonderful thing, and I absolutely hope it can be expanded. It's completely outside my orbit. I don't even work for the NHS, let alone the sort of management and financial structures of the NHS that are almost certainly the barrier here.
Yeah. Sounds like one of the joys of devolution. Maybe when your paper is ready, actually the charity can get behind it and actually go to the devolved assemblies and encourage them to participate in that. I'm sure it's a matter of funding rather than philosophical disagreement about the value of that kind of tool. But maybe we could get behind that and try and get that rolled out, because actually if it would be useful for hemochromatosis, it would undoubtedly be useful for other conditions as well. And preventative healthcare seems to be the new kind of mood, certainly at Westminster. So tools like this really should be more broadly available, I think. Adrian has an observation which I think is along a similar theme. Actually, I'm not sure it's a question, but it's an observation. Adrian says, you mentioned Scotland and England several times during your talk, but Wales didn't figure very highly in your discussion despite the high risk in that area. He just wanted to draw attention to the map of Wales, where it was split into north and south, which didn't reflect the diversity of the population in different regions of the country. I presume that map is the ICB map.
So the ICB map, I can't do much. I can plot for the DigiTrials. Oh, no, because that's DigiTrials, which are Wales. We have tens of thousands of people from Wales recruited in Swansea, Cardiff, and maybe in Wrexham. I don't quite recall. So we could look more granularly in Wales. I'd be very open to that. Clearly, it's well known that the people in Pembrokeshire are a little bit distinct from those in other parts, neighbouring parts of Wales. It's not impossible that Anglesey would also be more distinct, but in my experience, North Wales is very, very genetically distinct from the rest of the British Isles, regardless of whether you're in Anglesey or in Colwyn Bay or wherever you might be. There's a very strong genetic signal of isolation there, and they may very well have high frequencies of hemochromatosis variants, or indeed other variants. It's a place that really ought to be studied more. For sure, we can break up Wales. It's a question about, the more you break things up, the smaller your individual samples get, and then my bragging about having big sample sizes and not being subject to chance falls down a bit. But there's certainly scope to break it up a little bit more. I mean, Ed is going to be rolling his eyes because I just agreed a map with him yesterday. I can go back, and I've already been back at him 3 times since yesterday, because I realised I wanted Merseyside separate, and then I realised I wanted Cornwall separate. So I'll send him an email later, and we can split Wales up a little bit more.
Yeah. So some of these maps, the boundaries are basically determined by sort of geopolitical kind of criteria, administrative regions.
Yeah, because that we
can't
can't
reflect population. I think that's really the issue. We're not making a statement about Wales being north or south.
No, we're a bit stuck with we can only break up according to some of these geopolitical divisions that exist, because that's what the data allow us to do. So,
okay, that's great. And there's quite a few more questions. We'll keep going as long as we can. Someone who's anonymous, who I presume is in Northern Ireland, says, why is the NHS waiting list to see a consultant and get a vivisection so long for people in Northern Ireland, especially when there's a higher risk to the population? I'm not sure that's necessarily a question for Jim. That's maybe a sort of more rhetorical question, which I'm happy to take, actually. We regularly contact senior leaders in the health service in Northern Ireland to draw this to their attention regularly. I wouldn't say weekly, but certainly more than twice a month. Okay. The NHS in Northern Ireland is pretty close to breaking point. That's for a whole range of reasons, which are not things which we as a charity have much influence over. But for those people who are interested and also living and resident in Northern Ireland, we will very shortly be announcing a meeting at the Northern Irish Assembly in February, and that will be to launch the charity's forthcoming report, which is a health economics report, which we've been working on now for just over 2 years with FTI Consulting, looking at the health economics case for screening in Northern Ireland. And I don't think I'm giving too much away today to relay the key finding of that study. So this is a study which we've commissioned from a group of very experienced health economists. The key finding of the study is actually there is an absolute cast iron economic case for screening everybody in Northern Ireland in their 40s. Okay. And if you want to know why it's not everybody in their 30s or their 20s or their 70s, if you're interested, you can read the report, which is coming out in February. But that launch event at the Northern Irish Assembly is actually going to be introduced and started by Mike Nesbitt, MLA, who is the health minister for Northern Ireland. So that's a sign of some of the persuasion that the charity has been applying to the situation in Northern Ireland. Mike Nesbitt, for those of you who maybe not familiar with Northern Irish politics, became health minister not that long ago, but he is very, very aware of a lot of the challenges in Northern Ireland. And if you are a resident in Northern Ireland, there is currently a consultation running with the Department of Health in Belfast, which you are free to get involved in. We as a charity are putting a submission in, basically looking at how do the NHS in Northern Ireland address some of the issues around waiting lists by restructuring the way in which they use their hospitals. Okay, so if you're interested in responding to that or talking to your MLA about it, do a bit of Googling. You'll find the consultation online. Department of Health Belfast are running it. I think it's got a closing date of the 17th of January. But if you want to have your say about waiting lists and hospitals, that's a good way of doing it, because frankly, the situation is pretty abysmal. And I'll give you a good example of that. So we were over in Belfast actually just a few weeks ago doing some work on a forthcoming project. And one of the ladies there had been in a blood donor and been vivisected successfully for 15 years. She lived south of Belfast. She retired. She made the mistake, as she now describes it, to move north of Belfast into the Northern Trust Board. And she has now been put back on a waiting list for 5.5 years before she can start any form of treatment. And she has had her case taken up by the health minister. She's had her case taken up by her local MLA, and the health board are refusing to see her any more quickly than in 5.5 years' time. So We're very acutely aware of the problems in Northern Ireland around waiting lists. We welcome your support in lobbying or advocating, particularly with elected representatives. And if you're based in Northern Ireland, a little bit later on today, you'll be getting an email from us, if you haven't already received it, inviting Haemochromatosis UK members in Northern Ireland to come along to that meeting at the Assembly in February in order to press the flesh with the elected representatives and leave them in no doubt as to what the concerns and priorities are of the community. So without dwelling too much further on Northern Ireland, we have a couple of other questions in here. Just wanted to pick up on these with Jim. There's a question from Diana about cascade testing or cascade screening. She wonders, is this being taken on board by GPs?
Well, my understanding is that at least in the Western Isles, that there is a process for that. And I think this could clearly be done by GPs. It's not rocket science. It involves interviewing someone to understand who their first degree relatives are, and then either getting the person to share a letter with the first degree relatives, or depending on the interpretation of privacy law, giving the address of the relative to the medical person so they can send the letter out. So I see no reason why that couldn't happen. And I understand it is happening in some small places, but sometimes things are easy in small places to get to work than in bigger places. But yeah, again, I don't work for the NHS, so I don't have any official comments on this. That's just my take as a professor at the University of Edinburgh.
Right. There's another question relating to the outcome of this research. Will this be published, and will best practice be published as well?
So absolutely, our primary aim, my function in society, is to do research and discover things about the world and then publish it and disseminate it both to other scientists and then communicate that to the public and indeed to policymakers. So we will publish this in an open access journal, so one of the ones that's not behind a paywall, so that other scientists can read it, but so that stakeholders, people with an interest in this can also read it. So yes, 100%, and I hope it will be useful as part of an evidence base for changing things. This, being an activist is something I'm sort of doing, but that's more about the charity. My job is to do research. That's my specialism, my expertise, and God knows how many years of training. If I drop all that and become an activist, it's not perhaps the best use of my time. So I am happy to support these things, but I think my thing I can do the best is to provide good evidence and publish it and promote it, and then the charity and others will be able to use that in demanding change. And I stand for change, and I'm happy to help, but I can't take a lead in that.
Yeah. Indeed. There's a question about the genetics 5-year strategy, I think the Scottish one. Was there any input by geneticists to that 5-year strategy?
Yeah, well, you'd think so.
It's not a daft question, actually, as we'll come on to in a moment. But
as far as I can see, there was not any input from academic geneticists, while there may have been input from geneticists in the employ of the NHS, clinical geneticists, who I guess are mostly doctors of medicine who with a specialism in genetics, which is not quite the same thing as having a PhD in genetics. So there were some, but maybe not the right ones. There is to be a review, and I'm trying to be part of that review, but I was rebuffed a little bit by the minister in a reply about 2 weeks ago. Thanking me for my very valuable input that will be discussed, and thanking me for my offer of being involved in the review, but missing the next sentence about coming to the meetings. So stymied a little bit there. This is my first foray into how these things work. But I've been having very good advice from someone in Edinburgh who knows more about this, but it's just hard. I think, feel they have the expertise they need. I disagree. That's the situation. But publishing papers that show, the more papers I publish showing more and more of this, they can't ignore. That helps. That gets in the public domain. Journalists are my friend. They you know, we had an article in the Scotsman on the 2nd of December. We had one in, I forget, was it the Times? You know, more and more and more of these eventually it gets people talking about it, and then it's the public at large to be asking for it, and eventually this will happen, but it's somehow slow.
It's painfully slow. Let's be honest, it's painfully slow. Just with respect to that Scottish 5-year strategy, actually, we as a charity have been involved at slightly arm's length, actually through the Genetic Alliance UK. So we're members of Genetic Alliance, and Genetic Alliance actually do an amazing job of advocating with policymakers when it comes to these types of strategies and making sure that there is actually some consideration of the patient perspective, because quite often there wouldn't be without actually organisations like Genetic Alliance or Haemochromatosis UK kind of going, excuse us, but had you thought about this? What I will say about the Scottish 5-year strategy is actually in some respects it's better than the English one, because actually they have considered it as not a rare disease strategy. So in England, it's actually characterised as a rare disease strategy for genomics. And when people think about rare diseases, they think about things that maybe affect 1 in 30,000 people, really quite unusual conditions. And one of the challenges that we have with policymakers is we're trying to say to people, actually, hemochromatosis fundamentally isn't rare, but it is rarely diagnosed. So fortunately, as a result of some of the advocacy that ourselves and Genetic Alliance put in a couple of years ago, the Scottish strategy does actually talk about genetic and rare conditions, whereas the English one, they found that was just too much of a mouthful, and so it's a rare disease strategy. And so we continually find ourselves talking to Department of Health people and saying rare and genetic disease strategy, even though it doesn't say that on the cover. So it does illustrate some of the sort of practical challenges we have actually in advocating for people with hemochromatosis, because we're not a rare community, but we are rarely diagnosed. I'm going to move on to a couple more questions, and then I think we will try and finish before 2:00 because Jim will be entitled to a cup of tea and possibly a sandwich at that point. He's doing very well so far. We've got a number of questions in the Q&A relating to, very specific health questions. What I say to those people, we're not going to cover those off now. Jim is not a doctor of medicine, as he's already said. And actually, this wouldn't really be the right forum. But if you want to contact the Haemochromatosis UK helpline, the helpline's open weekdays, Monday to Friday, 12 till 3 on the telephone. It's also available via email. And if it's outside of those hours, you can go to the Haemochromatosis UK website and you can ask Alice, our AI chatbot. And Alice knows a huge amount of hemochromatosis. She doesn't know very many jokes. I see some people at Christmas have been asking her for jokes. Alice is not great with jokes at the moment, but she's very good with hemochromatosis. So if at 2:00 in the morning you have a burning question about transferrin saturation or ferritin levels, go to the website or use the MyIron app. You can ask Alice. You'll get a reliable answer from Alice if you need to ask when the helpline is closed. So please do reach out to the helpline if you have specific questions. There is one other point that I just want to raise, because someone, I think a couple of people put it in here, about can I donate blood if I have high ferritin or if I'm not in maintenance? Again, the Haemochromatosis UK website, have a look at the Can I Donate section. The rules have changed quite a lot over the last couple of years in response to our lobbying. I'm happy to say that in most of the UK, you can be a blood donor, even if you're not in maintenance. But unfortunately, in Scotland, due to an IT issue, which was explained a little bit last week, actually, on one of our seminars with the SMBTS team, in Scotland, you do have to be in maintenance. But elsewhere in the UK, you don't have to be in maintenance, but you do need to meet other eligibility criteria. And they're so different and so long for different nations. I couldn't begin to go through those. So please, 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 if you're interested in blood donation, go to the Haemochromatosis UK website. We've got a whole section on there, and we keep it up to date because the rules are always changing, largely as a result of us advocating, campaigning, and sometimes just basically nagging the blood donor services to make changes in favour of our community. I'm going to come to a question now from Edward, which I think I'll give to Jim. Edward asks, if screening is the main priority, how do we begin to influence politicians, NHS trusts and clinicians to divert funds to these programs? And where does the new money that will be required come from?
Well, I think to take the second bit first, I actually think screening will save the NHS money in the long term, because, well, it's very easy to see how well, for all of these things, because you're going to avoid these liver cancers, you're going to avoid for the BRCA genes, the breast cancers, and all the huge costs of the various operations required, end of life care. That doesn't quite answer where the money's going to come from now, because you're dealing with now versus the future. But I think that's the overbearing thing to keep in mind. This is about preventative care, which is cheaper than the model we have now. What was the first part of the question again?
I think the first part of the question is, how do we go about getting the NHS and politicians to sort of get on board?
The approach I've taken is, I think it's brilliant, these Jewish programs. They're brilliant for the Jewish people, but it's a peek at the future. And it's also brilliant because we can use arguments around equitable provision of service, which they're all very keen on. It's in all these executive, and so it should be. So because the Jewish ones are there, it provides quite a strong argument for me about Shetland, or for when we get our map out, we may have other places. Haemochromatosis is actually, I can tell you this, the lowest in the whole of Britain is in Shetland. So some things go up, some things go down. So it's not a big worry there, but it is going to be in other places. And so I think an argument based around equity is perhaps a strong one. They've got it plastered all over their sort of visions and slogans and so on. And we now have some real examples where it's not equitable, because the risk to the Jews is X. We can then work out the risk to people in Northern Ireland. We can do a simple math to show, well, this is a high risk community and they have this provision. Well, here we have another high risk community and there's a thing you can do to solve it and you're not doing it. So it's not an equitable provision of service. That's what I've been trying to hammer home to the Scottish minister, and they haven't gotten that far. But I think it's a case of ideas on a postcard. We should approach this from all sides, top level, grassroots level, and everything. But that's what I've been trying to do. That's what first came to my mind when I read these documents, because it is iniquitous.
Mm. And for those who aren't familiar with Genetics, actually, they're a charity a bit like ourselves, who about 6 or 7 years ago set up a screening program specifically for the Jewish community, because there were about 8 or 10 genetic conditions that were particularly prevalent within Ashkenazi Jewish circles. And before we set up the Haemochromatosis UK genetic screening service, we spent a lot of time meeting with and talking with the Genetics team, who are doing some really very groundbreaking work in order to learn the lessons of some of the things that they've done. And Genetics have been doing things which actually we as a charity, we don't do. So, for example, they will actually provide counselling to potential life partners with respect to whether they should actually be life partners or not, or whether they should have children together, because their genetic profile illustrates a very, very high risk of one or more of these 8 or 10 very unpleasant, often childhood affecting conditions. So we tip our hat to the team at Genetics, who've been great advisors and supporters of the work we're doing. And actually, it's great to hear that Jim also recognises the groundbreaking work that they've been doing for that specific community, because they started as a charity doing screening. It was funded by Jewish philanthropists. It was very, very expensive, but it was funded by Jewish philanthropists. And they eventually got the NHS to take it seriously enough for the NHS to fund it. And that's hopefully where we're going with haemochromatosis. But as we've already alluded to, the going is quite heavy at the moment. We still need a bit more oomph behind us. And hopefully the work that Jim and his team is actually going to help build the evidence base that supports a more proactive approach towards screening for haemochromatosis. I just want to pick up a couple more questions, and then we will let Jim go for that cup of tea and a cheese sandwich. We've got a question that came in from Anton. Anton is saying, given the condition generally is so easy to treat and control, why is it the government and the NHS and medical establishment are so against genetic screening? given the relative small cost per individual?
That's the
Why
key
is it?
question. That's the key question, isn't it? At the moment, I mean, if we had all this evidence base 10 years ago, I think we'd have had an easier, in some ways, it'd been more difficult because more of the old guard were still in power. But finances weren't so ruined because we're now really running into it that there's just no spare money. They can hardly run the services that they're supposed to be running, let alone try a new thing. So there is a true financial argument. I honestly, well, it gets into politics, right? But we may need to pay more tax to get the NHS up to where it needs to be. I'm not the guy who can answer that, but I think it's more than just the bean counters coming down on every department saying spend, you can't, cut. I do think it's a paradigm change that's required, and they're not used to that. Only happens every however often, where there's this real restructuring of how things are done, and this is quite a big one. We might not. So people get institutionalized, right? I'm not a psychologist, but they do, into how things are and the way things are, and this is demanding that they reverse out of that and go down a new pathway. And I think that's hard. I don't think people even realize the degree to which they're stuck in a rut. And Neil and I come into this from two different angles from each other, but also a different angle from someone who's gone through medical school and practiced medicine for donkey's years in the NHS. And things that seem obvious to us simply aren't to these people. There's also, I think, a third strand to it, which is there's a history, I believe, in clinical genetics of not asking too many. Don't go to 23andMe or someone else or any other such company. You don't know what evils are lurking in your genome. You don't want to open Pandora's box. And I don't have that attitude at all. And I spent my whole life working in genetics, just not in a healthcare setting. There are some things in your genome that you really, really, really ought to know about, because they're going to save you, or at least ameliorate. We all die, right? But you want to make it as good as you can while you're alive, ameliorate these conditions, put them off as long as you can, avoid them if possible. And it just seems like another tool. They invent MRI scanners, they invent new forms of surgery. I don't know what's on the forefront of medicine. This is no different. It's another tool, actually quite a cheap one, that could influence a very, very large number of people. And I'm sometimes a bit dumbfounded as to why. But those are a couple of ideas as to why it might be the case. But sometimes I think someone just has to come in and bash their heads together and see if they can see the light. And so the more work we do around this, it can only help.
Fantastic. Well, you're not a political person, as I think you've already mentioned, but maybe we should vote for you for Prime Minister next time around. We'll see if our mileage improves after that. I want to just bring this session to a close. It's been really fascinating, and I think we could probably talk about this for hours, actually. There's a lot of really interesting angles. For those of you who put a question into the Q&A and it hasn't been tabled, I'm sorry about that. We kind of are running out of time. But as I say, if you have a question that is in some way kind of clinical, or you have a question about your specific family or your specific health circumstances, we're not able to answer those types of questions in this type of forum. But please, please, please do get in touch with the Haemochromatosis UK helpline. Victoria, our specialist nurse, is on the helpline today. So reach out to her. She'll be around until 3 o'clock. And then also on weekdays, except the bank holidays over the Christmas period, the helpline is also open noon till 3 p.m. And as I say, we're doing email support as well. And if you get stuck outside of ours, you can always ask Alice on the Haemochromatosis UK website for some advice, and she'll do her best to help you. So I think this really just want to say thank you ever so much to Jim for the work that he, Shona, and the wider members of the team, including Ed in Dublin, are putting into this. We as a charity are very, very excited and very thrilled to be financially supporting this. Just by way of explanation, the Furnau Award was named after Janet Furnau, our founder. Janet set up the charity in 1990. Her husband had genetic hemochromatosis and sadly died shortly after the charity was founded of his condition. And Janet herself was awarded an MBE in 2014 and sadly passed away a year or so ago. So we've named this award after Janet for all of the amazing things that she and her wider family have done to support people within the GH community. And we look forward to hearing more about this as the project develops over the next few months. For those of you who are Haemochromatosis UK members, you'll get regular updates on email. So if you haven't checked out the e-bulletin, please do. That's where you'll find that information. It comes out usually the first weekend of every month. And we will socialize and circulate details more widely to the clinical academic communities and also the GH community at large through our social media channels and also through email. So everybody's get an opportunity to keep an eye on this project as it develops. And obviously, once there is something that has been through peer review and is published, people will be able to read that for themselves in an open access journal, which is really important because, as Jim says, quite a lot of these journals, they're kind of paywalled and they're very, very expensive to get access to. Jim and his team have made a fundamental commitment to open publishing, which we fundamentally support as a charity. If you're going to do research, there's not a lot of value if you then hide it from people and they can't actually see the fruits of the labor. So we're very supportive of that as well. So Jim, I don't know, do you have any final words would you like to close on before we finish up today?
I don't know if I do, but except to say thank you very much for the award. While these data sets exist, we would never have been able to provide 6 months of focus to do this work. It's a reflection of the state of affairs today. There's so much of this data around in these huge biobanks, but it's not all being used to its full capacity because there's not enough of a workforce, or they're not guided into the things that are interesting. So I was delighted to become aware of Haemochromatosis UK, which was actually via your Aberdeenshire sampling program, and then to meet you and then to apply for and be awarded this. It's super interesting to me, not an area I'd focused on before. It just fitted in so well with our work, and I thought it was something where we could contribute. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to. We'll have our map in January. We need a couple more weeks to work on it. So yeah, watch this space.
Okay, well, we'll let you have Christmas Day off. You can have a couple of mince pies, but don't push it any further than that. We're very keen to see the output of your work. So again, thank you very much, Professor Jim Wilson from the University of Edinburgh. And also thank you to everybody who's joined us for this webinar today. We really do appreciate your interest in this. For those of you who are interested in a video catch-up, it will be circulated to HUC members, hopefully in the next day or two, so you can catch up again if there's anything that you've missed. And other than that, I just want to wish everybody a very, very Merry Christmas and a peaceful and healthy New Year. Thank you.